affair. Remember, you can send us your comments and suggestions on Twitter at TV6TNT or at Jabari Fraser. Don't forget to use the hashtag #ACurrentAffair. Give us some feedback on Facebook too. CCN TV News is the name of our page. This evening we're talking women in politics. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa came to power in 2010 with a wave of support and hope from many who felt the nation needed a woman's touch. As Trinidad and Tobago's first female prime minister, she frequently used the fact that she's a mother and grandmother to emphasize her caring spirit and understanding. But 5 years after coming to power, has she brought policies for the advancement of women? Has she vigorously protected women who've been wronged in full glare of the public or in the sanctity of their own homes? Or has she played the gender card to defend herself in times of political difficulty? With the country in a hypersensitive mood, at election time, some sexist political talk is being used very loosely, starting with the opposition leader and his infamous dog and cat rant, and then last week, Tobago East MP Vanilla Alain Toppin using the parliament to say that PNM leader Dr. Keith Rowley is an aggressive man because he's allegedly a second-generation rapist. That has been endorsed by the leader of government business and senior minister Dr. Rudal Munilal, and the Prime Minister's out is that she accepts a half apology and says she wasn't in the house when Mrs. Alain Toppin stirred national disgust. On the set to discuss some of those issues facing women in politics and women by politics is Mrs. Nicole Dyer-Griffith, who is a former member of the current government. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for being the brave woman to come and join me on set to talk about these issues.
Yeah.
First thing is, do you think, as a former member of the government, that women are treated equally inside of the cabinet?
I did not sit within the cabinet. I was a government senator and a parliamentary secretary, therefore I was outside of the halls of the cabinet.
But you would have had some insight into
I did have some insight, and I think it would have been a little bit challenging for women within those halls at some points in time. And I'm assuming this, as I said, because I didn't sit in the halls of cabinet, but certainly you would sit within some types of parliamentary caucus and so. And it was up to you as a woman to ensure that you assert yourself to be heard.
We heard that clip from the Prime Minister at the beginning of this show, saying that she has had it tough because people scrutinize her stockings, her shoes, and so on. Do you think that's just a superficial assessment of the challenges that women in government and politics face?
It's one assessment. Whether it's superficial or not, I'll leave that for others to judge. But it is one assessment, and I think she's correct in making that statement, because when have you heard any statements being made about any male leaders' wear, their clothes, their attire, their shoes, or so she's correct in making that statement. However, there are so many other issues that need to come to the fore when you're dealing and treating with women in politics. For example, when we look at women in politics, many people tend to speak about women in terms of numbers of women involved in politics. But I think that it's time the conversation is changed to the tenor of women in politics, meaning we need to look at where women line up in politics. How many of them line up in leadership roles, in higher roles, and how many of them are in the roles of networking and mobilization and filling maxis and buses and so on. So that when we speak to women in politics, it's important that we look across from one realm to the next.
I think the numbers, according to the Parliament website, of women in the lower house under the People's Partnership are 6, that's 23%, and 3 in the Senate, which is 18.75%. Do you think that, well, you know, you said numbers aren't necessarily that important, but do you think that those numbers reflect well on the government?
Well, when I say numbers, I'm talking about numbers in leadership, because we tend to see it as a broad perspective and we just say women in politics. But it should be delineated women in leadership roles in politics as against women in other roles in politics. In terms of the numbers within our current confines, parliamentary confines, it's approximately 29%, and as it stacks against regional numbers, it is within the realm of the regional numbers. However, when you look at some of the Nordic countries, and so it falls way behind, because if we were to look at, let's say, Sweden is around 45% or so. So that in terms of global populations, we need to do a little bit more to increase those numbers at the leadership role and certainly at the parliamentary and cabinet levels in Trinidad and Tobago.
Now we have a situation where we have a significant number of women in government and in the parliament, in the legislature. But do you think it makes sense to have women who aren't necessarily aware of women's issues and women who simply follow a party line regardless of what is happening, even to their own detriment and to the detriment of their sisters, their mothers, their children? Does that make any sense?
You know, Jabari, I think the important thing to understand is that whenever, for example, Hazel Brown, she has this program called Put a Woman in the House of Parliament, and I was fortunate to have been part of that training program before I entered the realm of politics. So, and in doing so, I went into politics with a gender spectacle on, so that I was able, thanks to that program, to be able to be very much aware of not only the role I would play as a politician, but the role I would play as a woman politician, and what influence or impact I could bring to those issues of gender. So that it is important that whenever women enter the realm of Parliament and the halls of Parliament, that they do access some type of training to be ensured that they can see things from a gendered perspective. Because if it is you are not afforded the opportunity to see things from a gendered perspective, then you know you really are not going to be wanting to make so much of a difference.
Was that training from a gendered perspective available to female members of the People's Partnership Government?
It is made available to every single woman politician who would like to enter the corridors of government. It has been available by Hazel Brown and the network of NGOs for years. Just yesterday, I attended a panel discussion that was hosted by the Institute of Gender Studies, the University of the West Indies, in honor of Hazel Brown and her contribution. And I think that that training would have been available since in the early 90s or so, both to women of all political organizations as well as to women wanting to enter into the corridors of local government and so on. So it has been available to everybody.
But have the women in the partnership government, did they take it up when it was initially offered to them?
I can't speak for everybody. I can only speak for
Did
those
you take
of us.
It up?
Oh yes. I did the training in 2006.
And would you say that was beneficial to you?
Absolutely.
And making you understand and bring that special set of skills to government?
Absolutely. It was beneficial to me, and that is why I say it's so important for women politicians to enter into the corridors of power very cognizant of the gender roles, of the gender perspective, and cognizant of what they can do to continue to empower other women in those roles.
What did that training involve, and would that training still be relevant in 2015? You said it was available to you in 2006. You took it in 2006, but have the needs of women evolved enough, or have they become, are they different now in 2015?
It will always be evolving, and as I mentioned yesterday, I was a part of this panel discussion, and that was one of the things that we discussed: why women, why politics. And one of the issues that came to the fore, as I mentioned earlier, is we need to set a timeline as to when we are going to have a different type of conversation in terms of what is the contribution of women in politics, rather than how many women are in politics and how do they get to a certain point in politics, so that it is always evolving. And in terms of the tenor of that training continues to evolve as well, based on the types of experiences that women particularly have within the halls of politics. And one of the issues I want to also mention that was raised yesterday is the issue of responsibility. Because whether you're a woman or not, when you are provided with some type of authority, you also have some type of responsibility. And for us women, we tend to take on a larger portion of that responsibility based on the experiences, the gendered experiences that we would have had. So that when you find instances, for example, what took place recently in Parliament with MP Vanilla Allen Topping making these types of statements, it really hits to the core of this discussion that we're having in terms of gender and issues relating to gender in politics.
Hold your thoughts on that. That's coming up in the next segment.
I'm sure.
This is the Current Affair. Stay with us.
She could drink this, she could drink that. She could back up my dog, we could ignore she cat.
Did he know that an inappropriate, evil encounter resulted in the conception and birth of a boy child? This young girl was then raped by her father's best friend. The product today is the aspirant to lofty office. A child was born and grew to become aggressive, arrogant, bombastic, and spiteful. Mr. Speaker, I'm not a psychologist, although I've taught psychology. But now, we get a glimpse into why a man could be today the sum of his experiences.
Two interesting pieces of electioneering there. I'd have to say electioneering. Mrs. Dyer-Griffith, what did you first think when you heard that statement from Dr. Rowley?
Well, I was aghast when I heard this statement, and I felt it really was absolutely unfortunate.
And what about when you heard that piece of
I was astonished when I heard MP Vanilla Allen's statement, and it really, for me, Jabari, I began to question where are we headed from a political perspective. Separate the issue of a woman making the statement, but from a general political perspective, exactly where are we headed? To have those types of contributions made in Parliament, to have them recorded in the Hansard, to have pictures and images being demonstrated, and so it really left me absolutely astonished and speechless.
When you were still in the government, we had several attacks on women. We had Jack Warner attacking Asha Javed. We had Anna Roberts attacking Anika Gum-Sandiford and so on. How did you feel about those? And did you speak out? Why not?
Absolutely. I did speak out within the confines of government and within whatever confines in terms of caucus and so that we would have had. Because regardless of whether it happens to a reporter, to a journalist, to another member of the government or outside of the government, it is unacceptable. Regardless of where it transpires, it is unacceptable.
Did you feel strongly enough to speak out on the national front and before the national population to say that X, Y, Z is wrong and my minister, my fellow minister, wronged so-and-so, wronged this lady, wronged this woman?
I think perhaps I did. I think I would have. I can't recall exactly where or maybe how or whatever exact details, but I think perhaps I would have. Because I tend to try to do what is right because it is the right thing to do, even though sometimes I may be labeled as being emotional for so doing it. But that is one of the things that you tend to carry being a woman in politics. When you make certain decisions and you stand by certain principles, that people tend to, instead of calling it logical, they tend to label it as emotional.
Is that sort of sexist attitude something that's prevalent in the government, especially in the PP government?
It is something that is prevalent not only in the government, but it is prevalent within our society. Because you know, Jabari, the government is a microcosm of what transpires in our society, because you have people from within the society, within the government. So that it is prevalent, and it is something that we need to do a little bit more work on generally.
How can we tackle that?
There are a number of ways that it can be tackled, and as I mentioned, I keep going back to yesterday because it is so coincidental. We just had this conversation yesterday. One of the things that we can do is to include men in our gender-based discussions and conversations, particularly when you're treating with women in politics, that it's important that we include men in these discussions so that they can also offer their perspectives, and you can have a balance of the perspectives moving forward in terms of how we can treat with certain issues, both that are for men and women. You know,
there's all this talk, and there's always been this talk about a cabal running things in the government, in this PP government, and you know, the cabal is comprised mainly of, or only of men. Is that something that is concerning to you, this alleged cabal? And surely you'd have inside information on that, that these men could be puppeteering the Prime Minister?
I've heard that talk, and whilst I was within the corridors of government, I also heard it there. I was not privy to see any type of undertaking like that, but sometimes the decisions that were made, you would really sit back and question what was the tenor of some of these decisions. Whenever there is a group of persons that exist or not, and a group of persons that can influence another person, it sends a number of messages. One signal that it sends is that you are underestimating the intelligence of the person that you purported to be influencing, and I would not want to go that way, because I think that the Prime Minister needs to be afforded the opportunity and the space to make her own decisions.
But she says
when the decisions are made, she also needs to be responsible for the decisions that are made.
Speaking of puppeteering and so on, do you think that the Prime Minister's response to Vanilla Allen was acceptable and something that could be digested by the national community? She accepts an apology.
Well, it was a politically correct response. Politically correct thing to do was to condemn the statement because of the national furor that went with the statement, but she accepted her apology based on the fact that the Prime Minister will have to be the one to measure that, whether that decision to accept the apology would be to her political approval or political detriment. That is something that I'm sure she will be in the best position to do.
Now, you've spoken about the alliance, your new alliance, having touch and having contact with all of the political parties and all of them approaching you and your alliance to be part of their grouping. Is that something, that statement and the Prime Minister's seeming lack of action with regard to Ms. Vanilla Allen Toppin, is that something that could influence your decision to team up with the PP or something?
Let me tell you something, Jabari. The statement made by MP Allen Toppin was something that is absolutely unacceptable from any perspective. And certainly, I've heard many people make calls for her to be removed, and I think that the statement itself and what went into making the statement is certainly something that the powers that be need to really have a serious look at in terms of consequences for that statement.
But she didn't only say it once in Parliament that day. This is the third time I believe she said this. Would that affect, for example, if she approached you, if you were to be discarded by the TOP and by the PP, if she approached you to join the alliance, would you welcome her?
I would have some difficulty with that based on the personality that comes in. I would have to have a serious conversation to identify what was the rationale for making such a statement and what went into the thinking behind making such a statement. Because when you do that, you're not only impacting on the person that you set out to attack, but you're also impacting on persons who may have been sexually assaulted previously. So that to make such a grand statement and attacking persons who may have been sexually assaulted across the range is certainly something that makes you question a lot of the personality traits of an individual. So certainly it will be a little bit of a challenge for me, but you know, I am not Jesus Christ to cast the first stone.
If you were approached by, or in other words, what sort of women would you screen in your alliance to bring into the party? What would you look for in a woman? Would you look for someone who can bring much to your alliance, someone who can not simply toe the party line or toe the alliance's line or so? Would you fight for someone? Is there some sort of screening that you would go through for the women?
Yeah, sure. Certainly. The first thing that I would want to look for is some type of gender-based training because, as I mentioned before, it is important that you not only look at somebody, okay, you're a woman, so you could come in just because you're a woman, but certainly you must bring some type of character traits that you'd want to bring to the fore. For example, leadership, accountability. You have to be able to have a good rationale for wanting to get involved in politics. For me, Jabari, being involved in politics is very simple, and it is really just wanting to do something better, not only for my family and my friends or so, but generally to see a better Trinidad and Tobago. It is that simple. So that whenever someone wants to offer themselves for office or to offer themselves in service of the people, that is all that it boils down to, wanting to be of service to and of and for the people.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to go for a quick break, but before we do that, here's this week's We're MP segment, Vanilla Allen Toppin. These figures include her infamous rape contribution. Take a look.
This lady, look your MP, but wait, look your MP, wait, look your MP, look him there, looky there, don't let him get away, look your MP, but wait, look your MP, but wait, look your MP, look him there, looky there, don't.
Welcome back. This is the Current Affair. On set is Mrs. Nicole Dyer-Griffith. Do you think that the government, this People's Partnership government, dealt seriously enough with women's issues? And by women, I guess when you talk about women's issues in politics and in policy, you have to speak about groups that might be neglected or might be undervalued, such as children and those who maybe don't have enough attention focused on them. Do you think that the government has taken too long or has ignored the plight of women, especially with regard to the gender policy?
Well, certainly with regard to the gender policy, because it still has not been brought to fruition, and I know that that was one of the things that was dealt with on the election campaign. I know that the government has certainly done quite a bit in terms of for women and for children in particular. However, a lot more can be done, particularly within the framework of the gender policy.
You know, especially since the gender policy is seeming to ignore issues that are very important: abortion, homosexual rights, gay rights. How does that really passes a gender policy? Do you think it can be something that can be accepted by those underprivileged, or let me not say underprivileged, but by those communities that need the protection of the state and of legislation?
Well, certainly I think it's incumbent upon those particular communities to let their voices be heard. Because when you're speaking to a gender policy can cover a number of issues, and when issues are removed from a gender policy, then it really, it lightens the weight of the policy and really limits the scale of persons that you're trying to protect.
But those in Trinidad and Tobago, those are taboo political issues,
there are political issues that many persons try to segue away from and to sidestep and so. But these are issues and conversations that we need to have as a national community, because like it or not, they are before us. And if it is we're looking at really exploring a gender policy that will be wide-ranging and cover all of those issues, we need to have the conversations.
Is the Alliance having those conversations? And, having the conversation outside of government and opposition is one thing, but when you reach into the Parliament and reach into the executive, it's a totally different thing.
Completely different scenario, and that is why I remember when the People's Partnership was going into campaigning, and so that one of the issues that we were campaigning on is the issue of entrusting national conversations and having these national conversations so that you can have a referendum, so that whenever you have such issues that it will be taken to referendum, so that then the decision will be taken and made.
Yeah, but I mean, we've heard that from the Prime Minister, for example, about referendum, but it's not something that our Constitution provides for.
Which is where you have the issue of constitutional reform.
Right.
And it begs you to the other question is, if it is we're speaking to the issue of constitutional reform, then exactly what type of constitutional reform are we speaking to?
What do you think was the hindrance for this government to discuss those issues that were discussed beforehand, but were not discussed in the 5 years since?
You made mention of it politically, that from a political perspective is political taboo. So that you really have to have the political will. Now, speaking about it on a campaign trail and having the political will to get it done are two very different things.
Is that a weakness on the part of the Prime Minister as a woman?
I wouldn't say it's a weakness on her part, but remember, she operates within a confine of a government structure, and she has to make. She is the head of the structure, but she has to make informed decisions based on a collaborative movement. And maybe they may want to do that within the next term, but certainly promises were made to have certain things done within this term of office, and national referendum was one of those promises that were made. Constitutional reform was another one, and it certainly, I think, will be incumbent upon this administration to do whatever it could have done to ensure those things were covered within this first term.
Do you think that the work that was done, especially for children, we've had incidents, especially in the last 2 years, at the St. Michael's Home, at St. Jude's, where children have lost their lives in very unfortunate circumstances. Was enough done for children under this government? Because we see that children who aren't committed of any crime, minors, are being sent to homes that they are not supposed to be sent to. They're just
and being sent into the prisons.
Yeah, and being sent to the prisons.
Certainly, that is absolutely unacceptable for this day and age, for us to have young girls, underage girls, who people may not be able to manage them, to be sent straight to an adult prison. That certainly is unacceptable. And even though much work has been done to treat with children's issues and issues of protection of children, certainly much more can be done from both a legislative perspective and from a perspective of administration. And I trust and hope that even though the government has a short space of time left in office until the elections have come upon us, that something can be done to ensure that these areas are treated too, because it is unacceptable for us to continue to have these areas left untreated.
But what was your position when these things happened in the government? Did you speak out on them? Did you say to the Prime Minister, say to your party, say to your chairman, your political leader, listen, these things are not things that I can accept. These things must be improved on?
Well, Jabari, as I sit here, I am outside of the Congress of the People, and I'm currently. I know, and I am. That's what I'm leading up to. That I'm outside of the government. I'm outside of the COP for a number of reasons. And when it is I was the chairman of the Congress of the People, there are many conversations that were had, because of course you have to understand that you have a line, and when you have a line, you speak with your political leader, and you will anticipate that your political leader will speak to whomsoever he has to speak to ensure that what you and what your party says, that it is transferred upwards. And that is why I sit here in front of you, no longer affiliated.
Would you consider then, was one of our final questions, would you then consider a sort of activist role in politics? Maybe not necessarily seeking to be part of the legislature or the executive, but seeking to push the government and have sort of activist pressure on those who are in government?
Why should I stop at being an activist?
Well, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, because it seems as if when you were in power, that you were not able to have any sort of real impact. Tell me if I'm wrong.
No. There was some impact, but not the amount that should have been. And
so
I
try
think
another
that
route, the activist route.
I could try that, but I can also continue to try to ensure that I am positioned in a position of power to influence.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Dyer-Griffith. That's all the time we have for this week's A Current Affair. Remember, you can join us every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. right after TV6 Weekend News, and this show is rebroadcast on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Thank you very much to Mrs. Dyer-Griffith, who was one of the few brave women who took the opportunity to come and speak about women's rights. The PNM representatives said that they were not available, and the UNC representatives, PP representatives, simply never responded to our offers to come and be part of this discussion. This is A Current Affair. Have a good evening.